If you're an author or plan to be one, get excited because this podcast is for you. Book Marketing Mentors is the only podcast dedicated to helping you successfully market and sell your book. If you're ready for empowering conversations with successful marketing mavens, then grab a coffee or tea and listen in to your host, international best-selling author Susan Friedman.
Welcome to Book Marketing Mentors, the weekly podcast where you learn proven strategies, tools, ideas, and tips from the masters. Every week, I introduce you to a marketing master who will share their expertise to help you market and sell more books. Today, my special guest is Jason Jones. Jason is a longtime literary agent and publicist with a wealth of knowledge on how self-published authors can book radio, TV, and podcast interviews for themselves, garnering more attention for their work. Jason has led campaigns for 12 New York Times best-selling authors and over 400 books over the past decade, plus with major publishers all over the US. But it's self-published authors he really enjoys working with the most. So Jason, you're in the right place. Welcome, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the show. Thank you for being this week's guest expert and mentor.
Thank you so much for having me. No pressure, right? Being a master marketer. That introduction's a little bit, goodness.
We've got to set the bar high. Our listeners are expecting good stuff. So let's show them what it's all about. You've led major campaigns for publishers. I know you do a lot of that, working with some of the major publishers and best-selling authors. But we're talking here to many of our listeners are first-time authors. Many of them have either self-published or they publish through, a hybrid publisher such as Aviva Publishing. And it's daunting, this whole idea of marketing, promotion, PR. How can we make it easier for them?
I think there are a lot of people publishing books, not a lot of, well, I shouldn't say not a lot of people doing it well, far fewer people doing it well. That shrinks the pool and makes it much less daunting. And then beyond that, the people who are willing to take the right steps to engage an audience and build a real audience of readers and just stick with it and not quit. This is not something you can accomplish in months. This takes years to do. And those that do it well and stick with it, they'll make it. But I think the most important thing you can do right out of the gate is to lose that thinking, that thought process that says, I'll spend a few months writing a book and 6 months from now I can quit my job. This is something that is, it's a years-long pursuit. It really is. A lot of people jump into the marketplace as unknowns and expect people to like them and trust them and spend money on what they have to say, and they don't know you. There are plenty of other people out there they do know and like and trust, and those are the books they're going to buy. But building that kind of relationship has taken time. So you've got to be willing to do that and do that first before you write a book. If you're someone who maybe is just thinking about writing a book, I think that's the way you have to approach it. A lot of people, and you said this off air before we started today, that you also talk to a lot of authors who write that book and then turn their attention and thinking to marketing and publicity. And that's unfortunately a pretty tough way to go about it because it does, like I said, it takes months and months, if not years, to really build an audience via marketing.
It does. And for people to get to know you, as you said, like you, trust you, and see that you are a credible source, that you have expertise that can help them. As you mentioned earlier, off air, we were talking about the fact that people don't buy books, although authors think that they are selling books. Talk to us more about that, the idea of getting away from the idea of selling a book. Let's say I want to get onto a television station, I want to get some promotion, publicity, and I've got a book, and I say, hey, I've just written a book.
Yeah, well, that's not news.
Take it from there.
That's not news. And that's one of the first things I say, your book is not news. And that hits a lot of people pretty hard. To their family and their neighbor, it's news, but not beyond that. There are 3 million books published a year. A book being published is not news. What media wants to know, needs to know, is how does your message benefit our audience? What's in it for them? And that's what a reader wants to know. I mean, what's in this for me? Or endless number of things that I can spend my money on, ways I can entertain myself or inform myself. What's in this for me? Is this author someone who is going to be willing to engage me, someone I can follow online and have some fun reading bits and posts from each day, and maybe even engage in some back and forth with? And is there a continuation of this content somewhere else? Other people like me that are going to benefit from this information and want it, and maybe they're messaging and commenting on these social feeds. It's all about community, a community of readers, a benefit for those readers. So that's more the approach from a publicity perspective. This is not a news segment, is not an infomercial. You pay for those things. Paid media versus earned media, those are two very different things. People don't like being marketed to. They're marketed to all day long, and that's not what they want from you. They want engagement, and they want to know, what's in this for me? How does this book benefit me? What's the contribution it makes to a conversation we're having culturally? Because that's what you're doing. As an author, you're entering into a culture and conversations that are already taking place in that culture. How does your book and your message enter into that, contribute to that? So I can't remember what your question even was, Susan. I don't know if I answered it, but if you can't tell, you get me started on these things and I can just go for a while.
I totally get it. In fact, right at the beginning, you talked about taking the right steps. So if you were to give our listeners, let's say, 3-4 right steps, what would they be starting out? One of them you mentioned was thinking about this before the book comes out. But what else should they be thinking about?
I think, yes, that mindset shift is really, really important. The next thing from a more practical standpoint, I think, is to start getting your house in order online with a website, landing page for your book, things like that. I come across a lot of authors too, who they're ready to do media, but they don't have anywhere to send readers back to. Not only will media want to go to your website and see your social feeds, they're going to want to scroll through your social feeds, see how engaged you are with an audience, make sure you haven't said anything that's a little bit off the rails, might not agree with their audience's sensitivities. Those things are important, but you've got to get those things in order. I always like to say that before you invite guests over for dinner, you're going to make sure you give your house a good deep clean, right? And you want to put your best foot forward. So make sure your website's up to date and your social feeds have content that's fresh and engaging. That's another step people can take. I like the idea a lot of involving those close to you in the writing of the book. Let them know what you're working on and what you're thinking about. And as you kind of flesh out the content, you'll get, in the same sense you will with a focus group, an idea of which pieces of that information interest them most. And maybe you even get some questions asked that other readers may have. You can answer those questions. It's better to do this, not do it in a vacuum, but do it, with a group of interested parties that can help you put forth the best content. A lot of people they dive into a book, they open up their laptop and there's this brain dump, and next thing you know, they've got a couple of hundred pages that they want to turn over to an editor, and they haven't really thought through whether or not the content is organized in the best way, or thought through a second book, or is this the content that I should be laying out there, first? Maybe there's more than one book here. There's all sorts of steps and approaches, I think, first-time authors don't take. Those are just a few off the top of my head that come first to mind. Mindset change, preparing yourself online for visitors in media, then get into the writing of the book and doing it as part of a community, I guess, are the three things that first come to mind for me.
Excellent. You talked about earlier the idea of obviously getting on television or radio shows, and often authors think big. They think about the top shows, maybe Good Morning America, or when Oprah was big and interviewing people, they want to be on the Oprah show. One of her agents is going to call all of a sudden and say, hey, we want you on here. Right. Realistically, that's not going to happen, as we know, not for a first-time author. So where could an author get some visibility? What would you recommend as sort of starting points to start the visibility moving?
Yeah, locally. You're always most relevant at home. As a member of your community, as a resident expert, you are most relevant at home. Local media is where you get it. I often tell authors that come to me that have that idea that they're going to show up on Good Morning America, next week with their first book. You don't want to show up on Good Morning America next week with your first book. That's not going to be your best interview. If you've not done this, you don't understand what happens to a person when you sit down in that chair and that red light comes on. Those lights are on. That interviewer turns to you and welcomes that audience back from the break and asks you a question. And how quickly that 3 or 4 or 5 minutes can go. It's a learned skill. You need some seasoning. So do local media, radio, television, do small podcasts so that by the time you pitch those bigger outlets, you're ready for it. It also gives you an exponentially better chance to land those shows because they can see that you're informative, that you're entertaining, that you're not going to freeze when those lights come on. Those producers at GMA and the Today Show and those big networks, their livelihood is on the line every time they book a guest. And they're not going to take a chance with a first-time housewife author who's never been on television before. And that's just the hard truth. And you only get one shot at that. You really want to knock it out of the park. So lower stakes, do some local stuff, get some seasoning, sell a few books, get some encouragement and some confidence. Because like I said before, this is not about just selling books. It's about building an audience, building momentum. Oftentimes you do that local media, you end up with a couple of speaking engagements locally, word starts to spread. And that's how this works. You just can't skip those steps.
What about new media trends? What's out there now that self-published authors could take advantage of?
Yeah, well, obviously podcasts. There are over 1 million active podcasts, plenty of airtime to go around with podcasters. That's the first place I would go. And for us as an agency, one of the first things we do with an author, particularly newer authors, is we pitch the smaller stuff for them first, including, the podcasts, because it lets them get their feet wet. That's the way we approach that. I'm not giving your audience advice that we ourselves don't follow. But podcasts are where it's at. And there's such an opportunity, even if a show only has a few hundred or a few thousand downloads a month, there's a real opportunity there for you to not only find an audience that is laser focused on your topic, that needs to hear what you have to say, to engage with that host. You're going to send an email out to Robin Roberts or somebody on GMA, and you're not going to hear back from those folks. You will hear back from the host of a podcast with 600 downloads a month because they're out there hustling just like you are. They need guests. They want guests. They need that content. You have to learn to think of it that way too. You're providing them a service when you have a message that is of benefit to their audience. You're not asking for a favor. You have real content that is beneficial for them, especially as a nonfiction author. Fiction's a whole different ballgame, and we could talk about that. But nonfiction in particular, that's the way you have to view it and approach it. And those contacts are much, much easier to come by than hunting down email addresses for folks at big networks and national shows.
Well, and I'm just thinking about how, for instance, you approached me. We didn't know each other before we started this interview, but you have an intern working with you, and he reached out and wrote a poignant letter or message that said, hey, we understand what your show's about, and we think that Jason would be a good fit. And I agreed. I was like, yes, he's talking about the kinds of things that I like to talk about and to the right audience, versus somebody who approaches me and says, our client has written a new book and we think they ought to be on your show. Well, I don't necessarily interview people who've just written a book. That's not what this show is about. So
right. Lots of people write books. That's what we said earlier, right? A lot of people write books, but why your book? And why does my audience need to know about your book? That's what we teach our interns, and that's what we try and practice. Is it's always about the audience. And one of the first things we say in all of our pitches to media is, hey, we know you, we know who you're talking to. We've got a message and an author and an expert that we know would benefit them to hear from. Here's why. There's all sorts of tips and tricks and things that you have to learn as a publicist, working with media. That principle really extends beyond TV and radio and podcasts. It's in general, everyone's looking for that. Right? I mean, first, it's what's in this for me, whether it's an Instagram post or a radio interview. Do I stay tuned in? All those things. What's in this for me? Am I going to stay tuned in here? That message extends beyond media, and it's a principle that you got to accept.
You wrote a book called landing local media. Let's dig into that, because I think you mentioned earlier, this is a great place to start, that you could be a celebrity in your own town. Talk to us more about how would a first-time author go about looking at their local media?
I think the most important thing for you to do is to be familiar with the show that you're pitching and the audience. Watch the show, listen to the show. As one of my close friends, on-air friends, has said, we've talked about this topic. If you expect me to pick up your book and read your book and be familiar with your message and your audience, then spend a few minutes and become familiar with mine. That's only fair. Be familiar with who you're pitching before you send out that email. And then let them know, I'm a member of this community. I understand this community. I know it's important to this community. As someone who lives here, like you, our kids may even go to the same schools. Here's why what I have to say is important and why I know it will resonate with this community. So that is the first step. Let them know right away at the outset of that email who you are, why you're writing, and that you're local. Because you have to keep in mind, these folks, even local television producers and radio producers, get hundreds of emails a week from people who want airtime. They really have to parse that down to just a few. So it's important that you send them the right information in the right order. And that if you don't hear from them the first time, that you try again, that you're persistent and but patient, you're polite, professional, personable, all those things. They don't owe you anything. You just have to stay at it and understand that they are hearing from a lot of folks. And it's your job to convince them of why, what you have to say is important to that local audience. That's the biggest part of the job, is just reaching out to the right person with the right information at the right time. And a big part of that too, Susan, if I run the risk here, rambling on a little bit too long, is being prepared when that opportunity comes. I think one of the most frustrating things as an author, and I've been there myself years ago, when I know that I'm the expert on a particular topic, I'm the source that news needs to be talking to, I'm the guy that should be in front of the camera, news happens, all of a sudden what I have to say is extraordinarily relevant, but I don't have a press kit put together. I don't have the right information. I don't know who to reach out to. All these things need to be ready. You need to have your gun loaded and cocked there, right? So when that news story hits, 10 minutes later, I can have 4 or 5 emails sent off to the right folks, letting them know that, hey, when you're ready for someone to break down what's happening, I'm the guy here locally or nationally. If it's a national trend, something's happening, how does it affect the people of our community? Maybe it's, big economic news and I'm a financial planner or banker in our hometown here. I can talk about why interest rates, why the spiking, how that affects our local community. You just have to pay attention and be ready, be prepared, write the right email, reach the right people. So that's how it happens. Chance favors the prepared mind, right?
Yeah, and I love that, is looking at what is topical and how can you take your subject matter and your messaging and relate it to, as you said, either that local trend, or it might be a national, it might be an international, a global trend, and how it affects the community. So I think that is so poignant here, and a message that I hope you heard that, listeners, because yes, be prepared and look at how you can relate your book or your message. It's not about the book, it's about the message to whatever's going on. Even something like if you're in stress management and the idea of, or burnout around the holiday time, this is a very stressful time for people. Then how can you relate? If your subject matter is burnout or stress management, how can you relate that to your local community? So
that's right.
Yes, I think
everything
that's perfect.
That lens. That's right. The analogy I've always made is that of a cocktail party, right? If you're at a cocktail party, you approach a group of people that are having a conversation. You don't really know these people. You don't walk right into that group and change the subject. You approach that group, you listen, you hear what they're talking about, what's important to them. And as you figure out what you have to say that's relevant to that conversation, you say it in an informative and entertaining way so that people want to hear more from you. At some point, the topic of the conversation may turn to you. Someone may say, hey, you're a really interesting guy. What do you do? Who are you? And maybe there comes a natural segue, a natural point in that conversation for it to turn more to what it is you want to talk about. But it's the same way with the news cycle. We're talking about certain things and you are unlikely to be able to change that conversation So you just have to figure out how what you have to say contributes to it, or wait until the news cycle cooperates. And sometimes that may take a bit, and that's okay.
I think that's the hard part often. I know I've got some authors that they say, oh, I tried that and it didn't work. What should I try next? You've mentioned it several times as the whole idea of perseverance. I mean, it may not happen the first time or the second time or the third time, but maybe the fourth time or the fifth time. But they've just got to know who you are and what you do. And if you keep reminding them, there's going to come a time when they say, yeah, oh, maybe we should be talking to Jason or to Susan or Mary about this particular subject.
That's right. They will, if you can stay top of mind and not be a pest, not be someone whose email they block or someone that, they'll remember. I've had countless instances in my career where I have pitched an outlet with an author or expert, and I thought that I'd swung and missed, and we just, we moved on. But then months later, news would break. All of a sudden, that person's relevant, and I get an email that says, hey, Jason, you reached out several months ago with this person. Are they still available? You are on their mind. If you've done your job and stayed in front of them and been clear about who you are and what you know, a lot of those folks, and I speak from experience, before we were married, my wife was a television news producer. So I know a lot of these folks are very organized. They tend to file people away by subject matter or by city. Where are they? So that when the time comes, do I know anybody in Chicago? Boom. Okay, here's the 8 people. Do I know anybody that's an expert on this particular topic? Boom. Yes, I do. They've got to be able to find people quickly. So just be one of those people. Make yourself easy to find, easy to reach. And the other part of this thing too that I failed to mention earlier, Susan, as far as things you must do before you pitch yourself out there to media, you've got to build some flexibility into your calendar, some availability. You're on their schedule. If they call and you don't have anyone to watch the kids, well, that's too bad. They're going to move on to someone else. If you don't have any days off at work, you can't be at the station tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. You need to make sure you've got some flexibility built into your calendar. You have somebody on call that can come over in a moment's notice and watch the kids. Or if you're asked to fly somewhere to be on set, you've got all that covered. You've got a shirt that's been freshly pressed at the cleaners and is ready to go. You need to be ready because all of this happens very quickly. That's a big part of it. Just be able to say yes. There's nothing worse. And I've had it happen plenty of times. We work with 10, 11, 12 different authors a month. An author tells me he's available next week to do media. We send out a pitch to media. They ask me for that author next week, and all of a sudden now he's not available. And you know that the media have to be sitting there and asking, well, why did you pitch this person to me if I can't have them? That's frustrating for them. So make sure that if you're asking for their airtime, that you're available to be on their program.
Yeah, they don't wait for you. They don't wait till you're ready, as you said. Something happens, they want it now. And
right.
You've just got to, do whatever you can to make it happen.
Right.
So, Jason, our listeners always like to know more about a guest, how they can contact them. Talk to us about that. I know that you have some different tools and do-it-yourself tools. So talk to us about those.
Yeah, thank you for asking, Susan. That's very gracious of you. I try not to be that guest that over mentions their product or their book. That's not a lot of fun for a host either to listen to that. So we do have some tools and resources for self-published authors. You mentioned when we first started the show that we do work with all the major publishers and major media, but I love working with first-time authors. There's still so much enjoyment and excitement about what they're doing, enthusiasm. They really believe in their message. I really love that. I love seeing them succeed. A lot of the authors we work with have been doing this for many, many years. And a book is more, it's something that they're obligated to do at this point. Or they don't want to do media. They signed a contract, and it's less fun sometimes than seeing someone's first book birthed. That's really fun. But at the same time, what we do as publicists is extraordinarily time consuming. And we have to offer guests up to these big national shows that are qualified and ready to be there. So all those things mean that we don't often get to do full publicity campaigns with very many self-published or first-time authors. I've heard from so many of them the past few years that want help. And before, I had to just kind of turn these folks away and wish them the best. And I never liked doing that. So what we did was we built toolkits, DIY PR toolkits that provide authors with email scripts. How do I pitch media? What do I say? We provided lots of email scripts, media training videos. We can custom build a press kit. We know exactly what needs to be included in a press kit, how much of it, placement, all those things. Media lists, probably the biggest piece of our toolkits is custom built media lists, depending on the market you're in and the topic you've written on. Consultations are part of that package. We have a private Facebook community full of other authors and publicists and publishing professionals where people bounce ideas and questions off of one another. So all those tools we've made available as part of what we call the local PR toolkit. And that is at local, LOCAL, PRtoolkit.com. And that's to help you book local media like we've been talking about through the last 30 minutes. That's the first step. So this kit helps you do that. Beyond that, we've also got a Publicist starter kit. And that's publiciststarterkit.com. That's where you find that. And that's a much smaller package, a starter package. And you can check that out and see which one of those, may be helpful to you. But I don't know of anybody else that's doing that. I'm really glad we've been able to build this. We just got it off the ground last year. We saw great success for a lot of our authors with it, and they're engaging us on Facebook. It's been great. But I think that's what we do that will be most helpful for your people.
I agree. Yes, because I know hiring a publicist can be pricey, and you've got to be able to not only start it, but continue it. Because as you said early on, it's not something that you just do and then expect miracles. It does take time to build. So being able to do it yourself, giving people the tools, that's really invaluable. So we'll put those links in the show notes, Jason. And Great. We always end off asking our guests for a golden nugget. What would your golden nugget be? What would you like to leave our listeners with?
I think this is an easy one, Susan. You and I talked about this, is just to remember you're not selling a book. You are providing content. You're engaging people. Just be a person. Don't be someone else trying to sell me something. Be someone that I can engage with, that I enjoy, that I trust, that I like, that I can see in my feed every day. The book sales will come. If you put book sales first and become just somebody else out there pushing a product on me, I will turn you off. You cannot approach this that way. Just be a person. Be personable, be polite, informative, and fun, and stick with it. This takes time, but it is well worth it if you just stick with it.
Excellent. Well, thank you. This is amazing stuff. Listeners, you're going to have to listen to this a few times because there are some gems that have been wrapped up in this interview that you may not have caught the first time around, but I think you summed it up very nicely too, Jason. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. And listeners, if your book isn't selling the way you wanted or expected to, let's you and I jump on a quick call together to brainstorm ways you can ramp up those sales, because you've invested a whole lot of time, money, and energy, and it's time you got the return that you were hoping for. Go to brainstormwithsusan.com to schedule your free call. And in the meantime, I hope this powerful interview sparked some ideas you can use to sell more books. Until next week, here's wishing you much book and author marketing success.